Close your eyes for a moment and feel the ground beneath your feet. Solid, reassuring, permanent. But what if I told you that this very foundation, this earth that holds you steady, conceals secrets more profound than any treasure chest, more intricate than any labyrinth ever imagined by human hands? Tonight, we descend together into the forgotten world that exists parallel to our own, just a few feet below where you sit, where you walk, where you sleep each night, unaware of the silent cities, ancient chambers, and whispered stories that pulse through the darkness like a hidden heartbeat. The invitation has always been there, hasn't it? That curious pull toward the unknown depths, the way your eyes linger on storm drains and subway grates, wondering where those tunnels lead when they disappear into shadow. It's the same instinct that drew your ancestors to peer into caves, to follow underground rivers, to carve their deepest secrets into stone walls that would never feel sunlight. We are creatures of the surface, yet something ancient within us remembers the safety of the deep places, the comfort of being held by the earth itself. Tonight's journey will take us through 13 hidden secrets that lie beneath our world, each one a doorway into understanding why humans have always been drawn to create, to hide, to live, and sometimes to die in the spaces between the surface and the molten core. These are not merely historical curiosities or architectural marvels, but windows into the human soul, reflections of our deepest fears and most profound longings, carved in stone and silence. If you're ready to let go of the familiar world above and join me in this gentle descent into wonder, then settle in, breathe deeply, and let your imagination follow my voice into the first of these hidden realms, where every shadow holds a story and every whisper echoes with the weight of forgotten time. Asterisk. Long before humans learned to build upward toward the sky, we learned to burrow downward into the earth's embrace, seeking not just shelter from the storm, but something deeper, return to the womb of the world itself. Picture, if you will, a time when your ancestors had no word for home except the mouth of a cave. No concept of safety except the feeling of solid rock overhead and earth walls that had stood since the world was young. In the painted caves of Lascaux and Altamira, these early humans did something extraordinary. They took their first tentative steps toward immortality, not through monuments that scraped the sky, but through images pressed into stone walls deep underground, where the only light came from flickering torches that cast dancing shadows across scenes of hunting and dreaming. These weren't mere shelters, but the world's first cathedrals, where the act of creation became sacred ritual, where the darkness itself became a canvas for humanity's earliest prayers. The caves of Chevet, hidden for 30,000 years, until a narrow opening revealed chambers filled with horses that seemed to gallop across stone walls, with lions whose eyes still gleam in the beam of modern flashlights. Tell us something profound about our relationship with the underground world. These images weren't painted where others could easily see them. They were pressed deep into the earth, into spaces so narrow that their creators had to crawl on hands and knees, carrying their colors and their visions into the heart of darkness itself. Think of those ancient artists working by torchlight in chambers where sound itself took on different qualities, where their voices would have echoed strangely where the temperature remained constant regardless of the seasons raging above. They chose these places not despite their isolation from the surface world, but because of it. In the underground realm, they found something that the open sky couldn't provide, a sense of being held, protected, enclosed within something larger and more permanent than themselves. From the sea caves of the Mediterranean, where early humans gathered shells and told the first stories, to the rhythm of waves echoing through stone chambers, to the high mountain caves of Tibet, where hermits would spend decades in meditation surrounded by rock walls that had never known direct sunlight. We see the same pattern emerging across cultures and continents. The underground world offered more than physical protection. It provided a space for transformation, for the kind of deep thinking and spiritual practice that seems to require separation from the ordinary world above. These first underground dwellers understood something we're only beginning to rediscover: that beneath the surface lies a different quality of silence, a different relationship with time, a different way of being human. In those painted caves, surrounded by images of animals that had never seen daylight, our ancestors created the first museums, the first libraries, the first sacred spaces designed to preserve what was most precious across the span of centuries. As we follow their footsteps deeper into this underground journey, we carry with us their understanding that some of life's most important moments happen not under the open sky, but in the embracing darkness below, where the earth itself becomes both shelter and sanctuary, where the act of going underground becomes a way of going inward, into the deeper chambers of human experience and imagination. Imagine descending through a narrow stone staircase into what you assume is a simple basement, only to discover that you've entered the top floor of an 18-story city that plunges deep into the earth, its lowest levels reaching down nearly 300 feet below the surface. This is Q, perhaps the most astonishing example of human ingenuity ever carved from solid rock. A place where 20,000 people once lived their entire lives, in chambers and corridors that had never felt the touch of natural sunlight. Walk with me now through these ancient streets, if we can call them that, passages so perfectly engineered that they've remained stable for over 1,000 years. Their walls smooth from the countless hands that once traced their way through the darkness. Here, in these buried neighborhoods, entire families raised children who learned to navigate by touch and memory, who knew the echoes of their own footsteps, reflected off stone walls as intimately as surface dwellers know the sound of wind through trees. The architects of Q understood something profound about human psychology, that people can adapt to almost any environment if it feels like home, if it provides not just the necessities of survival, but the small comforts that make life meaningful. So they carved wine cellars where families could gather for celebration, chapels with soaring stone arches where wedding ceremonies could echo through sacred spaces, even stables where horses could live their entire lives underground, breathing air that traveled through ingenious ventilation shafts that reached all the way to the surface world above. But perhaps most remarkable of all were the defensive innovations, massive circular stones that could be rolled across passage entrances, creating impenetrable barriers that turned each level into its own fortress. Picture the absolute silence that would fall over these buried streets when those stones rolled into place, sealing 20,000 people into their stone world, protected from whatever dangers raged above, while they continued their lives in the patient darkness below. The children born in Daringque grew up with a completely different relationship to space and time than their surface-dwelling cousins. They learned to measure distance not by the position of the sun, but by the number of chambers between here and there. They learned to tell time not by shadows on sundials, but by the rhythms of communal meals, by the echo of prayers rising through stone passages, by the subtle changes in air pressure that told them when the great stones had been moved into defensive positions. These weren't people hiding from life. They were people who had discovered an entirely different way of being alive, one that prioritized community and security over individual space, one that found beauty in the smooth curves of carved stone walls rather than in distant horizons. Their world was measured in torch lengths rather than miles, in whispered conversations that carried through stone corridors rather than shouted messages across open fields. Today, as you walk through the restored passages of Daringque, your footsteps, joining the millions that have worn these stone floors smooth over the centuries, you can still feel something of what those ancient residents must have experienced, the profound quiet that comes from being completely enclosed, the way sound takes on different qualities when filtered through solid rock, the strange comfort of being held so completely by the earth itself. And Daringque was not alone beneath the landscape of Cappadocia. Archaeologists have discovered nearly 40 similar underground cities, connected by tunnels that stretch for miles through the bedrock, creating a vast network of buried communities that once housed hundreds of thousands of people in a world that existed completely parallel to the one above. These weren't emergency shelters or temporary hiding places, but fully realized civilizations that chose the darkness as their home, finding in the underground realm something that the surface world couldn't provide: absolute security, perfect community, and the deep peace that comes from being cradled by stone walls that have stood since the world was young. From the engineered perfection of Daringque, our path leads us deeper into the realm where history and legend intertwine like the passages of an ancient maze, where the underground world becomes not just a place of physical refuge, but a landscape of the human imagination itself. Here, in the mythic labyrinths that have haunted human storytelling for millennia, we find our deepest fears and most profound hopes given form in stone and story, in passages that exist as much in the mind as in any archaeologist's excavation. Picture yourself standing at the entrance to the original labyrinth, that impossible maze beneath the palace of King Minos in Crete, where the Minotaur waited in darkness at the center of a puzzle so complex that its very creator, Daedalus, could barely find his way out. But this wasn't simply a story about monsters and heroes. It was humanity's first attempt to understand what it means to be lost in the depths, to navigate spaces where the normal rules of direction and progress no longer apply, where every turn might lead deeper into mystery rather than closer to escape. The labyrinth speaks to something primal in the human experience, the fear of being buried alive, yes, but also the strange attraction to spaces that challenge our understanding, that force us to move slowly, to think carefully, to to trust in processes we cannot fully comprehend. When Theseus followed Ariadne's thread into that mythic maze, he wasn't just hunting a monster, he was undertaking the first recorded journey into the psychological underground, that inner landscape where we must face the darkest aspects of ourselves before we can find our way back to the light. But the Greeks weren't alone in imagining the underground as a place of transformation and terror. Follow the thread of story across cultures and centuries, and you'll find the same pattern emerging. The Celtic otherworld reached through cave entrances that led to halls where time moved differently, where a single night's feast might last 100 years in the world above. The Norse spoke of roots of Yggdrasil reaching down through layers of reality into wells of wisdom and springs of memory, accessible only to those brave enough to descend through the foundations of the world itself. In these mythic underground realms, we see reflected humanity's intuitive understanding that the deepest truths lie buried, that wisdom comes not from climbing toward the sky, but from descending into the hidden chambers of experience and memory. The river Styx flowing through the underworld wasn't just a geographical feature of Hades. It was a metaphor for the irreversible journey inward, the crossing from surface consciousness into the deeper currents of understanding that can only be accessed by those willing to navigate the darkness. Consider the underground rivers that flow through so many of these ancient stories. The Lethe that granted forgetfulness, the Acheron that carried souls toward judgment, the Phlegethon that burned with the fire of purification. These weren't random details added by imaginative storytellers. They were attempts to map the psychological landscape of transformation, to give form to the understanding that real change happens in the hidden depths, in spaces removed from the ordinary world's distractions and demands. Even in more recent traditions, we find the same patterns. The Sufi poets writing about underground chambers where the heart could be polished like hidden gems. The alchemists describing their work as taking place in sealed vessels buried deep in the earth, where base metals could be transformed into gold through processes that required absolute isolation from surface influences. These mythic labyrinths tell us something crucial about the human relationship with underground spaces. They represent our intuitive understanding that some journeys can only be undertaken in darkness, that some discoveries can only be made in places where the ordinary rules don't apply, where linear thinking gives way to spiral understanding, where getting lost becomes the first step toward finding something we didn't even know we were seeking. As we continue our descent through the real underground spaces that humans have created throughout history, we carry with us this mythic understanding that every tunnel is potentially a labyrinth, every underground chamber a possible site of transformation, every descent into darkness an opportunity to encounter aspects of human experience that remain invisible in the bright, familiar world above. Our journey through mythic labyrinths brings us naturally to the threshold of the most haunting underground spaces ever created by human hands. The vast necropolises that stretch for hundreds of miles beneath the streets of Rome and Paris, where millions of the dead rest in chambers carved from solid rock, their bones arranged with such artistry that death itself becomes a form of sculpture, silence becomes music, and darkness becomes a different kind of illumination. Descend with me into the Roman catacombs, those endless tunnels that honeycomb the volcanic rock beneath the eternal city, where early Christians carved their secret burial chambers in an age when their faith was punishable by death. Here, 20 meters below the bustling streets of the ancient world, these underground architects created something unprecedented, cities designed not for the living, but for the peaceful rest of the dead, spaces where grief could be transformed into art, where memory could be preserved in stone. The catacomb of Priscilla, known as the Queen of Catacombs, stretches for over 8 miles through the bedrock beneath Rome. Its walls lined with niches where bodies once lay wrapped in linen, their names carved into stone with messages of love and hope that still whisper across the centuries. But these weren't merely storage spaces for the dead. They were galleries of faith, decorated with frescoes that told stories of resurrection and redemption, images of fish and bread, of shepherds and sheep, painted by torchlight in chambers that would remain hidden from imperial persecution for hundreds of years. Walk through these passages today, and you'll understand something profound about the human relationship with death and darkness, that our ancestors didn't fear the underground realm as a place of ending, but embraced it as a space of transformation, where the boundary between life and death became permeable, where prayers echoed through stone corridors like conversations between the living and the departed. But if the Roman catacombs represent death as sanctuary, then the Paris catacombs reveal death as spectacle, transformed into something both beautiful and terrifying. Beneath the City of Light lies a vast ossuary, holding the remains of over 6 million people, their bones arranged, not randomly, but with careful artistry, walls built from femurs and tibias, decorative patterns created from skulls, entire chambers, where death has been choreographed into elaborate displays that seem to dance in the beam of your flashlight. The creation of the Paris catacombs tells its own story of transformation. When overflowing cemeteries threatened public health in the 18th century, workers began the monumental task of moving millions of bodies into the abandoned limestone quarries that had been carved beneath the city since Roman times. But instead of simply dumping these remains into underground caverns, they chose to arrange them with reverence and artistry, creating underground galleries where visitors could contemplate mortality surrounded by the carefully arranged evidence of millions of lives that had come before. Picture those workers, laboring by candlelight in chambers deep beneath the bustling streets of Paris, carefully arranging skulls into heart-shaped patterns, building walls from leg bones with the precision of master masons, creating decorative friezes from ribs and vertebrae. This wasn't merely practical disposal of human remains. It was the creation of underground art installations that used death itself as medium, that transformed the underground realm into a vast meditation on the temporary nature of surface life today. As you walk through these bone-lined passages, surrounded by the remains of bakers and nobles, children and soldiers, all equally reduced to calcium and dreams, you experience something that few surface spaces can provide: a direct confrontation with mortality that somehow becomes peaceful rather than terrifying, meditative rather than morbid. The underground world, once again, reveals itself as a place where normal emotional responses are transformed, where being surrounded by death becomes a path toward understanding life in both Rome and Paris. These vast underground necropolises represent humanity's instinctive understanding that some experiences require separation from the ordinary world, that contemplation of life's deepest mysteries becomes possible only in spaces removed from surface distractions, where silence and darkness create the perfect conditions for the kind of reflection that changes how we understand what it means to be temporarily alive in a world where everyone eventually joins the patient democracy of bones. Asterisk. From the peaceful democracy of the dead, our underground journey leads us to spaces designed for the living pursuit of the divine, where monks and mystics carved entire monasteries from solid rock, creating chambers where prayer could echo against stone walls that had never known distraction, where spiritual practice could be pursued in perfect isolation from the competing demands of the surface world. In the cliff faces of Meteora and the cave networks of Cappadocia, early Christian hermits discovered something that would reshape the history of contemplative practice, that the underground realm offered not just physical isolation, but a kind of psychic insulation that made deeper forms of prayer and meditation possible. These weren't simply people hiding from persecution. They were spiritual pioneers, exploring the connection between physical depth and spiritual depth, between descending into the earth and ascending toward the divine. Picture the monastery of Marsaba, carved into the walls of the Kidron Valley, where monks have maintained continuous worship for over 1,500 years in chambers that seem to grow from the living rock itself. Here, in cells barely large enough for a sleeping man, hermits would spend decades in contemplation, their daily rhythms marked not by the movement of sun and shadow, but by the call to prayer echoing through stone corridors, by the subtle changes in air temperature that marked the passage of seasons in the world above. These underground monasteries reveal something profound about the human search for the sacred, that divinity seems most accessible in spaces that mirror the hiddenness of God, in chambers where the ordinary world's constant noise gives way to the kind of silence that allows for deeper forms of listening. The monks of these stone communities understood that true prayer required not just quiet, but the specific quality of quiet that comes from being completely enclosed, held within spaces that themselves seem to be listening. Travel east, and you'll find the same pattern in the Buddhist cave temples of Ajanta and Ellora, where entire mountains were carved into shrines and meditation halls, their walls decorated with frescoes that transform solid rock into windows onto enlightenment. Here, in chambers that took generations to complete, artists and monks collaborated to create spaces where the physical act of going underground became a metaphor for the spiritual journey inward, where the darkness of the caves paralleled the unknowing that mystics describe as the necessary precondition for true understanding. The cave temples of Longmen in China carry this understanding even further. Thousands of Buddha statues carved directly from cliff faces, each one emerging from the stone as if the rock itself were dreaming of enlightenment. These weren't decorations applied to caves, they were revelations of the sacred presence that the carvers believed existed within the stone itself, waiting to be uncovered by patient hands working in the filtered light of underground chambers. But perhaps most remarkable of all are the underground temples of Lalibela in Ethiopia, where 12th century craftsmen worked downward instead of upward, carving entire churches from single pieces of volcanic rock. creating houses of worship that exist completely below ground level while remaining open to the sky. Standing in the Church of St. George, surrounded by walls that were carved rather than built, you experience architecture as sculpture, as if the earth itself had been persuaded to pray. These subterranean sacred spaces tell us something crucial about the human search for transcendence, that the divine seems most present not in the obvious places, not in monuments that dominate skylines, but in hidden chambers that require intention to enter, dedication to maintain, and courage to explore. The underground realm becomes, in these contexts, not a place of burial or hiding, but a space of revelation, where the act of descending into darkness becomes a form of ascending toward light. In these carved cathedrals and stone sanctuaries, we see reflected humanity's intuitive understanding that the most profound spiritual experiences happen not in public squares, but in private chambers, not in the brightness of noon, but in the contemplative darkness of spaces that hold us like cupped hands, where every breath becomes prayer and every heartbeat becomes a form of worship offered to the patient. Listening stone. The same earth that cradled monks in prayer and held the dead in peaceful rest has also served as humanity's refuge during its darkest hours, transformed into vast networks of survival where entire populations have vanished underground to wait out wars, invasions, and genocides, emerging only when the surface world once again became safe for ordinary life. Beneath the Siuchi district, near Ho Chi Minh City, lies perhaps the most extensive war tunnel system ever created, an underground network stretching over 2 miles through clay soil that became home to thousands of fighters during the Vietnam War, complete with hospitals, schools, kitchens, and meeting halls, an entire shadow society that existed parallel to the conflict raging above. Picture families living for months in chambers barely tall enough to sit upright, children learning to read by oil lamp light, surgeons performing operations in underground rooms where the sound of helicopters filtered down through layers of earth like distant thunder. The psychological adaptation required for such existence goes beyond simple survival. It represents a complete reimagining of what constitutes normal life. In the Siuchi tunnels, residents developed new ways of measuring time, new rhythms of sleeping and waking, new forms of entertainment and education that could function in the compressed space of underground chambers. They created a culture of whispers, where the loudest sound might be the scratch of pencil on paper as children practiced their letters, where celebration meant sharing a single candle among dozens of people. But the Siuchi tunnels were neither the first nor the largest of such underground survival networks. Beneath the medieval city of Niort, in northern France, lies a subterranean city that sheltered 3,000 people during various conflicts. Its chambers carved from chalk cliffs and connected by passages wide enough for entire families to move through carrying their possessions. Here, during invasions and religious wars, surface dwellers would disappear underground for months at a time, maintaining their community life in chambers, where the walls still bear the graffiti of people who wrote their names and dates as proof that they had survived another winter of war. The underground city beneath Niort reveals something profound about human adaptability. Given enough time and motivation, people can create full communities anywhere, can transform the most unlikely spaces into places that feel like home. The chambers include bakeries with ovens vented to the surface through ingenious chimney systems, wells that tap into underground water sources, even a chapel where wedding ceremonies could be performed by candlelight while armies fought overhead. In the chalk caves of Chislehurst, outside London, 22,000 people sheltered during the Blitz, transforming abandoned stone quarries into an underground city complete with hospitals, libraries, and concert halls where musicians would perform for audiences sitting on stone ledges while bombs fell on the London streets above. These weren't desperate refugees huddling in caves. They were communities that had learned to thrive underground, that had discovered ways to maintain dignity, culture, and hope in spaces designed by necessity rather than comfort. The psychological impact of such underground survival goes far deeper than mere physical protection. In these buried sanctuaries, people developed different relationships with time and space, different ways of finding privacy and community in shared chambers, different methods of maintaining morale when day and night became meaningless concepts. They learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about preserving the essential human activities, teaching, learning, creating, celebrating that make life worth living. Perhaps most remarkably, many of these underground communities maintained detailed records of their subterranean lives, diaries written by lamplight, photographs taken in chambers that had never seen sunlight, even newspapers published in underground printing rooms and distributed through tunnel networks. These documents reveal that going underground didn't mean abandoning civilization. It meant carrying the most essential elements of human culture into spaces where they could be protected until the surface world once again became habitable. As we move deeper into our exploration of hidden underground realms, we carry with us the understanding that beneath our feet lies not just empty space, but a parallel world that has repeatedly provided sanctuary when the surface world became too dangerous for ordinary life. A realm where human ingenuity and adaptability have created communities that function according to different rules but serve the same essential human needs for safety, connection, and hope. Our journey from ancient caves and wartime tunnels brings us into the mechanical arteries of the modern world, where beneath every great city lies a second city built from iron and concrete, where vast networks of tunnels carry water and waste, where abandoned subway stations echo with the ghost sounds of trains that no longer run, where the industrial underground has become its own form of accidental architecture, beautiful in its functionality, haunting in its scale. Descend into the Paris sewers, those grand boulevards of flowing water that mirror the street system above with such precision that sewer workers navigate by the same street names that pedestrians use on the surface. And you'll discover that the underground city is often more rationally planned than the chaotic world above. Here, in tunnels large enough to drive carriages through, 19th-century engineers created a hydraulic masterpiece that still functions today, moving millions of gallons of water through stone and metal channels with the precision of clockwork. The reliability of tide. Victor Hugo understood something profound when he wrote that Paris has another Paris under herself, a Paris of sewers, which has its streets, its crossings, its squares, its blind alleys, its arteries, and its circulation. These weren't merely utilitarian pipes hidden shamefully underground. They were the circulatory system of urban civilization. As essential and as elegant as any cathedral, as worthy of admiration as any palace. The engineers who designed them understood that the health of the surface city depended entirely on the proper functioning of its buried twin. But perhaps even more haunting than active sewer systems are the abandoned subway stations that lie beneath cities like London and New York, entire platforms sealed off from public access, where trains no longer stop but occasionally still pass, their lights briefly illuminating tiled walls that haven't seen passengers for decades. The abandoned City Hall station in New York, with its elegant arched ceilings and intricate tilework, sits frozen in time beneath the busy streets. An underground museum of urban transportation where the only visitors are maintenance workers and urban explorers who slip through service entrances into spaces that feel more like cathedrals than subway stops. These forgotten stations reveal something melancholy about the pace of modern change, how quickly essential infrastructure can become obsolete, how rapidly the underground spaces that once pulsed with human activity can be sealed away and forgotten. Stand on the platform of an abandoned station, listening to the distant rumble of trains that pass without stopping, and you'll understand a particular kind of urban loneliness, the sadness of spaces designed for connection that now exist only in isolation. The London Underground's ghost stations tell similar stories. Platforms closed during wartime that were never reopened, stations abandoned when lines were rerouted. Entire sections of tunnel system that exist on official maps but are inaccessible to ordinary passengers. These spaces have taken on their own mythology among urban explorers and transit enthusiasts, who speak of them in terms usually reserved for ancient ruins, who document their tile patterns and architectural details with the reverence of archaeologists, studying vanished civilizations. But the industrial underground includes more than just sewers and abandoned stations, encompasses the vast networks of utility tunnels that carry steam and electricity beneath Manhattan, the service corridors that connect the basements of downtown office buildings, the maintenance spaces that most city dwellers never see but that keep the surface world functioning. These tunnels reveal the hidden complexity of urban life, the vast infrastructure required to support millions of people living in concentrated spaces in Tokyo. Beneath the visible city lies an even more complex underground realm, shopping centers, restaurants, and pedestrian networks that allow people to travel for miles without ever seeing daylight. Underground spaces so extensive that they constitute a true second city with its own weather, its own rhythms, its own culture. Here, the industrial underground has evolved beyond mere utility into a parallel form of urban living, where the boundary between surface and subsurface becomes increasingly meaningless. These modern underground networks remind us that the human relationship with subterranean spaces continues to evolve, that we're still learning new ways to use the earth beneath our feet, still discovering that underground doesn't necessarily mean isolated or forgotten. In the industrial undercity, we find evidence of humanity's growing sophistication in creating livable, functional spaces below ground, spaces that serve not just as shelter or hiding places, but as integral components of how modern civilization organizes itself, how it moves water and people and energy through the complex systems that make urban life possible. Asterisk from the documented industrial tunnels of modern cities. Our exploration leads us into the realm where archaeology meets legend, where the underground world extends beneath oceans and emerges in stories that blur the line between historical fact and mythic possibility, where entire civilizations may rest in chambers so deep, so perfectly hidden, that they exist now only in whispered rumors and tantalizing fragments of evidence. Consider the underwater caves of the Yucatan Peninsula, where divers following cenote passages have discovered chambers filled with Mayan artifacts, pottery and human remains left in underground spaces that were dry when they were placed there, but have since been claimed by rising waters. These flooded chambers suggest civilizations that understood underground spaces as sacred repositories, places where the most precious objects could be preserved in the eternal darkness beneath the water table, protected from the surface world's constant changes by layers of stone and time. The megalithic structures of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, mysteriously buried under tons of earth for reasons that archaeologists still debate, hint at patterns of underground preservation that may be far more common than we've realized. What if civilizations routinely chose to bury their most important sites, not as acts of destruction, but as forms of protection, understanding that the underground realm offered a kind of time capsule where knowledge and structures could wait for future discovery? These partially excavated sites raise haunting questions. How many other underground complexes remain buried beneath accumulated sediment and vegetation, their entrances long forgotten, their chambers intact but inaccessible? The ground-penetrating radar surveys that occasionally reveal massive underground structures beneath unremarkable hills suggest that our ancestors may have been far more extensive builders than we realize, creating underground networks that we're only beginning to rediscover. The legends of Agartha and Shambhala, those mythical underground kingdoms that appear in traditions from Tibet to South America, may represent cultural memories of actual subterranean civilizations, collective recollections of places where advanced societies chose to live beneath the surface, developing technologies and philosophies that diverged from those of surface-dwelling cultures. While we may never find literal underground paradises, the consistency of such stories across unconnected cultures suggests that the idea of hidden underground civilizations addresses some deep human need to believe that knowledge and wisdom can be preserved in secret places, waiting for the right moment of rediscovery. The Darren Q complex we explored earlier was connected to dozens of other underground cities by tunnels that archaeologists are still mapping, suggesting that beneath Cappadocia lies an entire buried region, a network of subterranean settlements that may once have housed hundreds of thousands of people in a civilization that existed almost entirely below ground. If such extensive underground development was possible in one region, what other buried networks might exist beneath other mountain ranges, other volcanic landscapes, other areas where soft rock made extensive excavation possible? Recent discoveries in the Amazon rainforest, where LiDAR technology has revealed vast earthwork complexes hidden beneath jungle canopy, suggest that ancient civilizations were far more extensive than previously imagined. If such large-scale construction was happening on the surface, it seems inevitable that some cultures would have chosen to build downward instead of upward, creating underground cities that remain hidden beneath forest floors, their entrances sealed by centuries of vegetation growth, the flooded caves of the Mediterranean, where archaeologists occasionally discover evidence of human habitation from periods when sea levels were much lower, hint at lost coastal civilizations that may have used underground chambers as temples, warehouses, or residential spaces. These submerged sites suggest that rising waters have claimed not just coastal settlements, but entire underground networks that once connected inland cave systems with seaside communities. Perhaps most intriguingly, the consistent reports from deep-sea exploration, missions of geometric anomalies on ocean floor structures that appear to ancient to be natural formations but to ancient to be icily explained suggest that our planet may harbor underwater ruins of civilizations that chose to build their most important structures in the deepest places, where time moves differently and preservation becomes possible across geological timescales. These mysteries of lost underground civilizations remind us that human history extends far deeper than written records, that beneath our feet and beneath the oceans may lie evidence of human ingenuity and ambition that challenges our understanding of how long people have been creating complex societies, how extensively they may have used underground spaces, and how much of their knowledge may still be waiting in chambers that have been sealed in darkness for thousands of years. As we pause in our journey through humanity's buried history, it becomes essential to explore not just what lies beneath our feet, but what lies beneath our consciousness. To understand why the underground realm simultaneously attracts and terrifies us, why we create myths about subterranean worlds and nightmares about being buried alive, why the same spaces that offer sanctuary also provoke claustrophobia, why descending into the earth feels both like returning home and like confronting death. The underground speaks to something primal in human psychology, something that existed long before our ancestors learned to build cities or write stories. In our dreams, descending stairs often represents the journey into the unconscious mind, while caves and basements become symbols for repressed memories, hidden desires, the aspects of ourselves that we've buried beneath the acceptable surface of daily life. The fear of being underground isn't simply about physical entrapment, it's about confronting the parts of human experience that we prefer to keep hidden, the shadow aspects of personality that Jung described as dwelling in the depths of the psyche. But this fear is balanced by an equally powerful attraction, a longing that draws us toward underground spaces with the same magnetic pull that leads us to seek out caves for exploration, basements for privacy, root cellars for the specific comfort that comes from being surrounded by earth. This attraction isn't merely about physical security, it represents a deep human need for what psychologists call containment, the feeling of being held and protected that we first experienced in the womb, that we seek throughout our lives. In beds and houses and embracing arms, the underground realm becomes, in psychological terms, a space of regression and renewal, where we can temporarily return to earlier states of consciousness, where the complexity and demand of surface life give way to simpler, more fundamental experiences. in caves and tunnels, surrounded by stone that has existed for millions of years. We encounter a different relationship with time, one that puts our brief surface lives into perspective, that offers the peace that comes from recognizing our place in much larger cycles of existence. This explains why so many spiritual traditions incorporate underground experiences into their practices: vision quests in caves, meditation retreats in underground chambers, initiation ceremonies that require spending time in dark, enclosed spaces. These practices recognize that certain kinds of psychological transformation can only occur in environments that mirror the inner journey, spaces where external distractions are eliminated and attention can turn completely inward. The psychology of underground spaces also explains our fascination with buried treasure, with archaeological discoveries, with the idea that valuable things lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. These aren't simply metaphors for material wealth, they represent our intuitive understanding that the most important discoveries in life come not from looking outward toward new horizons, but from digging deeper into existing experience, from excavating the layers of meaning that accumulate over time in familiar places. Consider how differently we behave in underground spaces. Voices naturally lower to whispers. Movements become more deliberate. Attention focuses more intensely on immediate surroundings. This isn't just practical adaptation to enclosed environments. It represents a shift into what we might call underground consciousness, a more introspective, contemplative state of mind that emerges naturally when we're surrounded by earth and stone. When the sky disappears and we're held completely within the embrace of solid matter, the therapeutic potential of underground spaces has been recognized by healers throughout history. Patients taken into healing caves, depression treated through time spent in underground chambers, anxiety addressed through exercises that involve gradually increasing comfort within closed spaces. Modern psychology is rediscovering what ancient healers knew intuitively, that certain psychological healing can only occur in environments that feel completely secure, where the unconscious mind feels safe enough to release long-held tensions and traumas. But perhaps the most profound psychological aspect of underground experience is the way it changes our relationship with mortality. Surrounded by stone that has existed since before human consciousness, breathing air that has circulated through chambers for millennia, we encounter a perspective on life and death that isn't available on the constantly changing surface. Underground, we experience what it feels like to be temporary beings moving through permanent spaces, to be brief flickers of consciousness carried within structures that will outlast us by eons. This encounter with geological time doesn't typically produce despair, but rather a strange form of peace. The comfort that comes from recognizing that our brief surface anxieties are held within much larger patterns of existence, that our individual concerns are both utterly important and ultimately insignificant when measured against the patient persistence of stone. In underground spaces, we discover what mystics have always known, that the deepest peace comes not from solving all of life's problems, but from finding our proper place within mysteries too large for complete understanding. From the psychological depths of our relationship with underground spaces, we emerge into the contemporary world to discover that the age of secret subterranean construction has not ended but simply moved into new forms, where government agencies and private corporations continue to hollow out vast chambers beneath the earth, creating facilities whose purposes remain classified, whose very existence is acknowledged only through leaked documents and the testimony of former workers who signed secrecy agreements they're technically still bound to honor. Beneath the mountains of Colorado lies NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, an underground city designed to survive nuclear war, where military personnel can live and work for months in chambers carved from solid granite, surrounded by blast doors that weigh 25 tons each, and connected to surface installations through tunnels that seem more like the setting for science fiction than contemporary reality. But Cheyenne Mountain is only the most publicly acknowledged of what intelligence analysts believe to be dozens of similar facilities scattered beneath military bases, government installations, and private research sites across North America. In Europe, the construction of these modern underground complexes represents engineering challenges that dwarf anything attempted by ancient civilizations. Climate control systems that can maintain perfect atmospheric conditions in chambers hundreds of feet below ground. Communication networks that can function independently of surface infrastructure. Power generation systems that could keep these facilities operational for years without external support. The workers who built these installations signed security clearances that prevent them from discussing even basic details of construction methods, creating a strange situation where some of the most impressive engineering achievements of our time remain almost completely hidden from public knowledge. Deep beneath Geneva, the CERN Particle Accelerator Complex represents a different kind of underground mystery, a 27-kilometer tunnel where scientists recreate the conditions that existed nanoseconds after the Big Bang, where matter is accelerated to nearly the speed of light in chambers that exist in almost perfect vacuum, where experiments probe questions about the fundamental nature of reality that previous generations could only address through philosophy and speculation. The scale of this underground installation, requiring excavation techniques borrowed from tunnel boring projects and precision engineering borrowed from space technology, suggests that the underground realm has become humanity's preferred location for pushing the boundaries of what's physically possible. But beyond these acknowledged facilities lies a shadow world of rumored installations, underground bases beneath desert facilities where unmarked aircraft are said to be tested and stored, subterranean research laboratories where classified experiments continue projects that began during the Cold War, tunnel networks that allegedly connect government installations across hundreds of miles of seemingly empty landscape. The evidence for these facilities consists largely of satellite photographs showing mysterious construction activity, reports from former military personnel, and the occasional congressional budget item that allocates funding for deep underground construction without specifying location or purpose. The psychological impact of knowing that such extensive underground activity continues beneath the surface of ordinary life creates a unique form of modern anxiety. The sense that important decisions affecting everyone's future are being made in chambers that most people will never see, by people whose names don't appear in public directories, using technologies that remain classified decades after their development. The underground realm has become, in the contemporary world, not just a place of physical refuge, but a space where power operates beyond public oversight, where the future is being shaped by projects that remain invisible to democratic scrutiny. Recent revelations about data storage facilities buried in mountain complexes, where the digital records of modern civilization are archived in underground vaults designed to survive electromagnetic pulses. Natural disasters protect the informational infrastructure of technological society. These facilities represent a new form of underground city, populated not by people but by servers, function independently of surface power grids and communication networks, to hollow out vast spaces beneath mountains and prairies for resource extraction have created inadvertent underground landscapes that rival ancient cities in their extent and complexity. Abandoned coal mines that stretch for hundreds of miles. Through underground seams, quarries that have carved cathedral-like chambers from solid rock. Oil and gas extraction operations that have created networks of underground infrastructure that will remain functional for decades after surface operations cease. Perhaps most mysteriously, urban explorers and investigative journalists continue to document evidence of underground construction projects in major cities that seem too extensive for their officially stated purposes. Utility tunnels that are larger than necessary for their supposed functions. Basement renovations in government buildings that require months of excavation. Construction projects that disappear below ground level for unknown depths before being sealed from public access. These modern underground mysteries remind us that the human impulse to create hidden spaces, to preserve important functions in secret chambers, to separate essential activities from the chaos and vulnerability of surface life, purposes may remain classified long after the original reasons for secrecy have become historically irrelevant. As our journey through the hidden world beneath our feet draws toward its close, we find ourselves carrying 39 secrets that whisper together like voices in a stone cathedral, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of human experience that extends far below the surface of ordinary awareness, far deeper than the casual glance of surface life ever penetrates. Walls by flickering torchlight, understanding that art itself began not under open sky but in the embracing darkness of underground chambers, where creativity could unfold without interference from the ordinary world's demands and distractions. We have followed their descendants, who carved entire cities from solid rock, who discovered that community could flourish in spaces measured not in miles but in the through human consciousness, where the minotaur waiting at the center of the labyrinth turns out to be not monster but mirror, reflecting back aspects of ourselves that can only be encountered in the patient darkness below. We have walked through the cities of the dead, where millions of bones arranged with careful artistry remind us that mortality itself can become a form of beauty, that the democracy of death creates underground communities where all surface distinctions dissolve into the shared silence of calcium and dreams. We have knelt in underground chapels where hermits spent lifetimes in prayer, where the act of descent became a form of ascent, where separation from the surface world became a path toward connection with something larger than individual consciousness. We have crawled through tunnels where families huddled during wars, where entire populations disappeared underground to wait out the storms of history, where human ingenuity transformed the most unlikely spaces into places that could sustain not just life, but hope, not just survival, but the preservation of everything that makes survival worthwhile. The utility networks that reveal the hidden complexity required to support millions of people living in concentrated spaces. We have ventured into the realm where legend and archaeology blur together, where flooded chambers and buried complexes hint at civilizations that may have chosen underground existence long before we realized such choices were possible, where the ocean floors and mountain depths may still harbor secrets that could reshape our understanding of how long humans have been creating complex societies, how extensively they may have used the underground realm as laboratory, sanctuary, and home. We have explored the psychological depths that make underground spaces simultaneously attractive and terrifying, that explain why descending into caves feels like returning to the womb while also confronting the grave, why the same chambers that offer perfect security also provoke the deepest anxieties, why the underground realm serves as both sanctuary and symbol for all the aspects of human experience that remain hidden beneath the surface of acceptable social behavior. And we have acknowledged that the age of underground construction continues, in forms both acknowledged and secret, where government facilities and corporate installations extend the ancient human impulse to create hidden spaces into realms of technology and security that previous generations could never have imagined, where the underground world has become not just a place of refuge, but the location where power operates beyond public knowledge. Secrets whisper together to remind us that beneath every step we take, beneath every foundation we build, beneath every assumption we make about the solid ground that supports our surface lives, there exists another world entirely, a parallel realm where different rules apply, where time moves according to different rhythms, where silence becomes a form of communication and darkness becomes a different kind of illumination. Tonight, as you return to your surface life, as you walk across ground that you now know harbors, chambers, and passages and forgotten cities, as you rest in beds positioned above earth that holds the dreams and bones and prayers of millions who chose the underground realm as their home, remember that you carry within yourself the same instincts that drew your ancestors into caves, the same longings that inspired them to carve sanctuaries from solid rock, the same understanding that some of life's most important experiences happen not under open sky, but in the patient embrace of stone walls that have listened to human voices across centuries and still echo with whispers of everything that has ever been hidden, preserved, and forgotten in the vast, where 39 secrets rest in chambers carved from time itself, waiting for the next curious soul, brave enough to descend into wonder, patient enough to listen to the silence of what it means to be temporarily alive in a world where everything essential remains hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary sight.